everyone. Welcome to the Stoa. Today we have Chris Kavanagh. Chris is a cognitive anthropologist and social psychologist who studies East Asian syncretic religious environments and is a co-host of the Decoding The Gurus podcast, a podcast that critiques what Chris and co-host Matt Brown call secular gurus. And people here at the Stoa know there's an emerging space, some of which has a para-academic quality, where people are engaging in becoming better thinkers and trying to make sense of what is, and doing this outside of an academic institution. I think a lot of good work is being done here, like from the skeptical community to the less wrong to street epistemologists. But one role that I think is neat is the role of the critic, and having the capacity to be a good critic, and one that ideally invites dialogue that affords an openness for people to change their minds. So that's part of the reason why I invited Chris here today. Chris and Matt have this checklist called on secular gurus, which was quite fun to read. So I thought it was cool, and I invited him on, and he's going to present on it or on secular gurus in general. And then we're going to pivot to a Q&A. So if you have questions anytime during Chris's presentation, just put it in the chat. I'll call on you, and you can ask Chris your question. So that being said, Christopher, welcome to the Stoa.
Hi, Peter, and thanks for inviting me and a nice introduction. I haven't updated like most of the websites that have my academic description, so I usually get introduced as a postdoc. So that was very nice. So yeah, and nice to see all the rest of you. I'll try to be critical but nice. And
yeah, so feel free to just jump right in, and then.
Okay, all right, okay. So am I already sharing the screen?
No.
Not yet. Okay. I should be familiar with this, having taught quite a lot in Zoom over the past couple of years. But in any case, so as Peter said, what I'm going to talk about today is this thing that we tongue-in-cheek call the Gurometer. And I'll first very briefly introduce myself and my background, and then talk a little bit about what the Gurometer is, and then go into the 10 features that make it up. So my background, as you can probably tell from my accent, is that I'm not from the US or England. I'm originally from Northern Ireland. But my academic background is that I started out in study of religion and social anthropology in SOAS in London, if any of you know, and then moved to Oxford into the dark side of anthropology, where we quantify things and cause much frustration to the social anthropologists. So I started studying cognitive anthropology at the Institute of Cognitive and Evolutionary Anthropology, and have continued working there since then. Did my PhD there and went on as a postdoc, and then moved to Japan, where I'm now based, and was in Masaki Yuki's social psychology lab for a number of years, and now I have a dual position where I'm a associate professor of psychology in Rikyo University in Tokyo, and I'm a researcher at Oxford's Center for the Study of Social Cohesion. So there's lots of academic jargonistic titles, but that's my background. It's kind of in between psychology and anthropology, and that means that my research involves doing kind of traditional online surveys, also small group experiments in laboratory settings. That picture is getting people to do an artificial ritual and fiddling around with environmental conditions to look at effects. But the anthropology part means that we also go into the field and collect data at ritual events like Matsuri events in Japan. And on a few occasions, I pretend to be an anthropologist by taking part in various rituals that we examine. So just to say, my background academically is probably an effort to fit somewhere on the bridge of combining quantitative and qualitative methods. And I like to think that's influenced some of the stuff that I do in Decoding the Gurus, but we'll see. And it's fair to say that I lean much more quantitative than qualitative at the minute. My specific area of interest, as Peter said, is ritual psychology, and I work quite a bit on modes theory of religiosity, this kind of analyzing the spectrum of different ritual types. But that's not what I'm going to talk about today. So the main thing that I'm talking about today is a kind of tongue-in-cheek checklist that myself and Matthew Brown came up with as we were working on this project that became Decoding the Gurus. So the Decoding the Gurus is a podcast with myself and the handsome Matthew Brown in the bottom right, who's a psychologist. And we look at basically, well, maybe a good thing to mention to start with is that the original motivation for starting the project was that we were talking about things online and on Twitter, as people are wont to do, and we noticed that we had a number of kind of parallel observations about this new crop of public intellectuals, which we came to term secular gurus. So I'll talk a little bit about what distinguishes them, but as academics are wont to do, Matt and I decided that we'd get together and write a paper. So we started fleshing out in Google Docs a paper and kind of identifying features of the secular gurus that we thought were distinctive or particularly characteristic of them. And that checklist is what then turned into the Gurometer that we use on the podcast. And we use it to look at the cast of characters that we examine and kind of add a little bit of a consistent backbone to our examination. The important things to note would be that it's not a scientific instrument, not a validated psychometric scale, and not a revolutionary theory either. It's really just pulling together observations from a whole Matt and I's experience in psychology and anthropology and the existing literature on research on cults and various psychological manipulation kind of research. The features that we identified are also not solely exclusive to the secular guru set. You'll see that like these things exist in lots of different domains and to different degrees, and all of them are part of a spectrum. So it may even be that some of them are quite healthy to have, but we do think that the checklist that we've created, if you're scoring very high, or the person that you're looking at is scoring very high on these features, it's rarely a good thing if all of them come together. And even if there's a couple of them where people are scoring highly, it's generally not good. So we've kind of created a checklist for bad gurus in a way. And this is not to say that everyone who might get the moniker of guru attached to them is necessarily bad. There might be people talk about stats gurus or like other types of gurus, and it can be used in a non-pejorative sense. When it is usually used, it is pejorative. And in the people that we've looked at, the majority of our assessments are negative. But I think it's important to acknowledge that, looking at somebody from this perspective does not necessarily entail that, you want to take them down, because it could be the case that you look at someone, see if these features appear, and they don't, but in many other respects, they fit into the niche that we are examining. So when I talk about secular gurus, what I mean are figures who have kind of emerged within the contemporary space and who offer worldviews or kind of philosophical approaches that do not fall neatly into the existing criteria that you might have associated with gurus, which would be religious gurus or kind of people with access to specific spiritual knowledge, right? Most of the people on the slide there are not people, with perhaps the exception of Russell Brand, that claim access to spiritual knowledge, right? They instead often will reference science or philosophy in general, kind of secular approaches. And even, Jordan Peterson is kind of an outlier in this because of the amount that he focuses on religion in his content. But even then, it's kind of given a like a more secular and psychological, metaphorical approach, as opposed to, spiritual and focused more on kind of metaphysics, although that creeps in. So simply to say that a lot of the earlier treatments of the kind of either cult figures or spiritual gurus or alternative health gurus, it doesn't really always fit so well with these kind of people, but they've amassed very large followings, and we don't think it's just the case that they are public intellectuals, which some people might argue, because the public intellectuals don't do all of these things that I'm about to take you through. They might do some of them, but it's this kind of unique combination that we think marks out secular gurus as different. And we can talk about who may or may not fit within that mold, but we've looked at a wide variety of people. We've looked at a lot of figures from the intellectual dark web that are often mentioned in the news as of late, but we've also examined figures like Robert Wright or ContraPoints, the YouTuber, Nicholas Taleb, and Rutger Bregman as well, the Dutch academic. So it isn't the case that we're only interested in the people that fall within the intellectual dark web. It's just that there happens to be a lot of them that fit that criteria. Okay, and when Matt and I do the episodes on Decoding the Guru, we tend to take some content, examine it, and kind of talk about it on the podcast. And then afterwards, we take these 10 criteria features that we've identified, and we try to assign a score between 1 and 5. But there's nothing extremely meaningful about the scores that we assign, but this is how we use the Gurometer. Okay, so the first feature we refer to as galaxy brainness, and it's a bit flippant, but it's kind of conceptualized well by that popular meme of the guy with the head exploding and with the cosmos inside it. And what we mean by galaxy brainness is this tendency for people not to have a specific area of expertise that they stay focused on, but rather that they offer takes across a whole cosmology of topics. There's almost nothing that they will refuse to offer opinions on, and when they do so, they tend to not do it with epistemic humility, right? So they might have a core expertise, say like they're familiar with evolutionary biology, but they will then argue that because of the familiarity with evolutionary biology, that they can work from first principles to apply that technical insight to a huge array of topics, maybe anything related to human social interaction, right? Which essentially makes you capable of opining on any topic that relates to humans. Another part of this is the tendency to connect a diverse array of topics in hugely speculative ways with very limited amounts of necessary caveats, right? So there's no issue with people having speculative theories and kind of, throwing ideas out there about alternative histories or whatever the case may be. But it's when they present those not as hugely speculative, but kind of as, in the same way that you would present the theory of evolution, then present your bespoke theories as if they're on an equal footing. Related to this, and this comes up later, is a willingness to use technical terminology and jargon, even when from outside their area expertise, or when they're extending that to other areas that it might not apply, like using Heisenberg's uncertainty principle or something, to discuss the result of an election, something like that. And the related to all of this is a dismissal of expertise that is constrained to particular topics. They tend to see that as illegitimate. But again, these relate to some of the other features that I'll highlight. Okay, so the second feature, somewhat disparagingly, is titled cultishness. And you can think about this as encompassing the broad range of negative manipulation and social control techniques that you probably associate with cults and traditional gurus. But it also, we use it to refer to this tendency to create very strong binary in-groups and out-groups, particularly where the in-group is a kind of select group of people who are able to see beyond mainstream narratives, or are able to approach things intellectually rigorously, whereas the outside group are those who are to be treated, disdainfully, looked upon with suspicion. And obviously critics are lumped into that category. In some respects, there's this willingness to acknowledge that there may be valid criticism of the positions that they want to advocate, but they will often say that they've never encountered it, that they've never encountered legitimate good faith criticism. So there's a hypothetical category of high quality good faith criticism, but unfortunately the only thing that the gurus tend to encounter is low quality bad faith criticism, and that is not really worth their time. This can also lead to the creation of kind of not traditional cults where you're going to have people on a compound, physically located somewhere in a particular geography, but with the development of Discord servers and Patreons and the Web 2.0 infrastructure, it's quite possible to create quite contained communities, including assigning people, within different hierarchical roles. And so there's this kind of dual tendency to praise the members of the in-group as insightful, worthy people, even, if they may not be particularly well credentialed or that kind of thing, but it's more about their open-minded approach, and to warn them about those on the outside. So creating this really strong binary between us and them, that's what we mean by cultishness, and which is an obvious red flag. The third feature is anti-establishment sentiment, or anti-establishmentarianism, as we give it like a terrible, hard to pronounce moniker. Nicely embodied by the image of Russell Brand in front of the Houses of Parliament. Now, anti-establishment sentiment is extremely common now. Extremely, that you can probably, it's probably harder to find people who are pro-establishment narratives, or whatever way you want to look at it. So this is one of those features that you will see across a whole array of areas. And I want to emphasize that it is not that there is no legitimate critique to be made of establishments or institutions. There's plenty of things to criticize. You can look at the work of Ben Goldacre or Stuart Ritchie, for example, who have done very good work critiquing the modern scientific and pharmaceutical industries. The replication crisis is another, very close to home development, which shows the limitations of academic institutions and standards within science publishing. But what we're talking about with anti-establishmentarianism is a kind of extreme version of anti-establishment sentiment, one where it's almost impossible for anything mainstream to be correct. You could see it as reflexive contrarianism, but it's not always that. It's essentially that the mainstream bodies, the institutions, are not fit for purposes, and they all ideally need to be completely revolutionized and replaced, or that if not that, then at least the leadership and the prominent figures all need to be removed and the kind of swamp drained. I think Eric Weinstein has put it as saying, nearly everyone in every institution is lying to you all of the time, right? That's the level of the sentiment that we're talking about. Not that you can quibble with the way that public health messaging is presented. So one aspect of this, which I think is interesting, but it's really a kind of footnote, is that it can't be the case that gurus will adopt mainstream positions. Like, for example, they will say that climate change is real and the evidence supports that. But often when doing so, when adopting the mainstream position, they will highlight that they are not doing it for mainstream reasons. The existing evidence, like from the IPCC or whatever, is not good. And they instead have some specific overlooked facts or information which allow them to reach the right conclusion, the same conclusions that others have reached, but for better reasons. And I refer to that as a kind of tendency towards science hipsterism. You know, you wouldn't have heard of the evidence I have for my positions. It's too niche. Okay. A fourth characteristic then is a tendency towards grievance mongering. And this one is hard to overstate how common it is in the content of the secular gurus that we look at. These tend to present the individual as beset by a kind of array of forces that are focused on holding them down, preventing their insights from being spread more widely. And it allows them to also explain why it is that despite their insights and the level of brilliance attached to them, that they have not received the recognition they deserve. So maybe they have new scientific theories, maybe they've developed like insights into pharmaceuticals that could, you know, cure most of the people currently suffering from COVID or prevent the 90% of deaths. But there has to be a reason then for why they haven't been allowed to do that. And this links into a tendency towards conspiracy theorizing that we'll talk about later. Another aspect of grievance mongering is a tendency to refer to a cadre of enemies and critics. Usually any critic falls within this category, people that are attempting to suppress them. And it is very rarely presented as that could be due to people having legitimate disagreements or criticisms of their perspective, but rather that they want to silence them, and they're often accused of working with the institutional forces or in defense of those in order to kind of prevent the insight from reaching the outside world. So you have it in kind of two aspects: the individual as a kind of martyr suffering for their followers, and for the often for lofty ideals, like, you know, the ideals of truth or of revealing corruption and so on. And you have it that they personally are suffering from these individual attacks from critics that they identify. Fifth characteristic is tendency towards self-aggrandizing and narcissism. My co-host Matt has emphasized that this is probably the key feature that we observe out of all the 10. It's the one that's most predictive, most recurring, and it's somewhat tautological because, you know, if you have a public profile, to some extent, you're going to have a degree of healthy self-regard. But again, we're talking about the points where that gets to an extreme, where you have a degree of grandiosity and self-importance, which is often far in advance of what your actual output presents, right? So this is people presenting themselves as saving civilization through podcasting, or having developed theories that would completely revolutionize developed fields of physics and biology, but they actually haven't published, you know, any papers, or a very limited amount of papers on that. It can also be that people have well-established careers and credentials, right? A good example is Peter McCulloch recently on the Joe Rogan podcast, or Robert Malone. Both are scientists with careers published, and in Peter McCulloch's case, a lot of publications. But those credentials do not prevent them from slipping into this presentation of themselves as revolutionary thinkers that are going unrecognized, and the subject of a kind of campaigns of suppression. One part of this that we notice in the content is that you have these figures that are hugely successful. You know, they've got millions of followers, they have massive audiences, and yet they'll still regularly reference how many people download their videos, how many books they've sold. It's kind of strange, because you would imagine that, you know, when you get to a certain size, that those metrics would be somewhat less gratifying, but it doesn't seem to be the case. And it's telling the amount that those kind of things get cited in conversation. Again, though, it isn't that this is unique to gurus. It's kind of maybe more that they have a susceptibility because of the tendency towards narcissism. Okay, the sixth feature is what Matt termed Cassandra Complex. This is his reference, because I'm not so familiar with the historical figure, or the mythological figure of Cassandra. So this is my limitation of scholarship. But as I understand it, the Cassandra was predicting the downfall and went unheeded. We call it the Cassandra Complex because the people that we're looking at, they're often presenting themselves as, like, Cassandra was vindicated at the end of the story. But in the case of the gurus that we want to discuss, it's more that they see themselves as being in that role and being vindicated, but not being recognized as such. So they tend to regard it as there's a forthcoming apocalypse. It might sound silly to put it in those terms with like millennialism kind of beliefs, but it is like that. If you look, for example, at James Lindsay and Michael O'Fallon, two people that we've covered, they're talking about the Great Reset and the coming, you know, the attempt to completely destroy Western democracies and capitalist societies and replace them with I think he termed it communo-fascism, but this notion that, you know, the revolution is around the corner. They are warning people about what's happening, the forces that are imperiling our societies, and people are ignoring it and failing to recognize that the information that they're giving is pertinent, or that they've been vindicated in the past. So they'll often point to predictions that they made, referencing like the stock market crash or so on. But when you look back at what they actually said, a lot of these people tend to have made very vague assertions that can only, you know, in a very rough sense, be associated with specific events that have happened. And for anybody that's familiar with psychics or that kind of thing, the people who may throw out a lot of predictions and then focus on the hits, it's kind of easy in hindsight to draw targets around where you were shooting, the so-called sharpshooter fallacy. So this feeling that society is heading towards a cliff and that they are warning is a common feature that we see of the guru set. Okay, revolutionary theories. What we mean by this is a tendency to present themselves as having developed a theory that will, if recognized and if adopted, lead to a paradigm shift in a given field, potentially across multiple shifts. It's the view that not that you're making a contribution to some scientific discipline or some academic discipline, but rather you are in line for a Nobel Prize because of how game-changing your insights are, although they continue to be ignored by the relevant disciplines. It's hard not to go back to the Weinsteins because they fit this paradigm quite neatly. But Eric has produced a theory of everything after many decades of kind of hinting at it. And as when it was actually released in paper form, there was not much of an impact from it, and there were various technical critiques. But that doesn't matter. So even if you release your theory and it does not instigate a paradigm shift in the field, it can then be presented. Well, the reason for that is because of the conspiratorial forces, or as Eric terms them, the distributed idea suppression complex, right? The DISC, protecting academic disciplines and those in power from disruptive forces coming from the outside with insights. So the important thing here is that it kind of ties in with the level of narcissism, because you really have to have a healthy self-regard to regard yourself as a pioneering figure on the same level as Einstein, yet you often will accompany that with a relatively modest output and primarily a social media following. Number 8 is pseudo-profound bullshit. And although this title is perhaps one of the more seems one of the less professional, it's actually a technical term from the psychological literature. There's papers on this by Gordon Pennycock and colleagues, where they're looking at language that superficially appears to be quite profound and insightful, but when you parse it out and when you break it down, it is offering trite or contradictory tautological insights, but simply dressing them up in this kind of metaphysical scientific garb that allows them to look as if they're very profound and revolutionary, as opposed to mundane. You can spend 15 minutes discussing some idea which boils down to, oh, America is currently has a partisan political system, and as a result there's a lot of social friction, right? But if you dress that up in flowery languages and loquaciousness, it can become a very insightful point that will give you a 20 or 30-minute talk, and a lot of engagement from people who are willing to listen to you. And kind of related to this, we've noticed a tendency for people within the guru space. I know, for example, you've had Jordan Hall on this channel, and I think he's an expert at this. The ability to kind of dive in to extended metaphors, referencing technical literature or technical concepts, and kind of, in some cases, especially with Jordan Peterson, connecting multiple metaphorical concepts in one metaphor. And this ability, it's very impressive. It's quite poetic in nature, but it often reflects a relatively shallow point when you break down, when you slow it down and look at what is actually being said with the metaphor, what the point being made is. And related to this is a tendency to use whenever you're talking about a technical topic, you tend to need to reference technical terms. It can be helpful, right? If you have a specialty, because it makes things that you don't have to keep defining complex terms using words which are not exactly accurate for it. But we're all familiar that people are able to use technical jargon and references and philosophical language in a way that is performative. Like it's not designed to make a point clearer. It's designed to show how many obscure philosophical terms you know, or how many technical subjects you've mastered. And this is very, very common in the guru spheres. It also means that if you engage with them in a critical fashion, there's a chance that they will kind of gish gallop you with technical terminology that can be hard to deal with. Number 9 is also a very important one: conspiracy mongering. I've mentioned it in a whole bunch of the other features that we've covered, but this tendency to see conspiratorial forces arrayed against you. And the usefulness of conspiracy theories is not just that they give you an understanding of a way to interpret everything that's happening in the world, as that there is some plan behind it that can be understood and potentially forwarded, but also it gives you a get out of jail card for any time that there is a criticism that appears against you, or why your worldview or some prediction that you made didn't come clear, because you can always reference that if you predicted something and it didn't happen, that this is still part of the conspiracy, right? Alex Jones does this quite often, where he'll say that something he predicted didn't happen because he predicted it, and people wanted to kind of prove him wrong. So all facts and events, when you adopt a conspiratorial mindset, can be evidence for a conspiracy. If studies come out for ivermectin, that can be people breaking through the mainstream narrative. But if studies come out that are negative, that's evidence that, you know, the mainstream has control and is pushing things down. And basically, whichever outcome that you want, you can manufacture and push and prod the facts into the relevant conspiracy to explain why things look a certain way, even if the supposed truth is something that doesn't seem well represented by those facts. And this kind of fits in with the Cassandra Complex, because it is often referencing that the world that we inhabit is not like the one that we previously had or our grandparents had, where these situations were not in effect to the extent that they are now, especially with social media. And the last feature is profiteering. So what we mean by this, I think most people are aware of, like, the difference between profiting and profiteering, but it's an excessive focus on extracting usually money from your audience. And this can take the form of gurus willing to endorse products and services, which would seem very odd for public intellectuals more generally. Particularly supplements seem to be something which is just universally popular, and perhaps because it links into the health and alternative wellness spaces. And similarly, we've been increasingly noticing that it makes sense to look at the guru sphere as a kind of network of people. I know Peter and others have looked at the kind of network relationships that exist across the internet and the little communities that form around it. But I think the guru sphere is one that is particularly good at extracting profit and using kind of audience share approaches in order to expand influence. So I think it's important to draw the distinction that this isn't just people publishing books about their ideas, right? That's normal. That's what intellectuals do, or academics, or just people with ideas publish books. They make money. even having Patreons or whatever the case is. These are all normal things in the current internet ecosystem, but we are really talking about an excessive level again, one that kind of pushes the boundaries, and that you would more associate with multi-level marketing than you would with traditional public intellectuals. Okay, so that's a bunch of features that we identify, and we have scored all the people that we've looked at on this, but we don't treat our scores as like some scientific quantifiable essence of how much of a guru is. It's rather that I think these serve as useful criteria to think about, and potentially as red flags that should go off when you're consuming content. If you see a lot of these features, it's usually not going to be a good sign. But I'm happy to discuss and hear comments or criticisms about any of that. So thank you all for listening, and sorry it took so long.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris, for that presentation. I'm going to just stop your screen share, and just are you good for at least 15 minutes after the hour? Because I imagine we're going to have some questions.
Oh yeah, I'm
cool.
Yeah.
So I have a few questions to warm you up, and this might be a question that Matt could field, but there's this term. I have his book right here by Michael Barkham. He's a conspiracy, an academic who investigates conspiracy theorists, and there's a book called True Conspiracy. He has this term that I quite like, stigmatized knowledge. And I'll read a passage. Most conspiracies theories exist as part of stigmatized knowledge. That is, knowledge claims that have not been accepted by those institutions we rely on for truth validation. And it says, not uncommonly, believers in conspiracy theories also accept other forms of stigmatized knowledge, such as unorthodox forms of healing, beliefs about Atlantis, UFOs, et cetera, et cetera. So the conspirituality kind of term that would fit there. But the part of that definition I quite like is institutions we rely upon for truth validation. And I sense that like a fault line or a battlefront in this sort of like culture war is this like trust in that phrase, institutions that we rely upon for truth validation. It maybe is even trust might be too strong. It's just like the sense of trust. And I'm curious what your thoughts on that. And if it's true, why is that the case?
Yeah, so I do think I like the term stigmatized knowledge. That I think that's a useful description. So, this distinction between people who trust implicitly institutions versus those who are willing to criticize them, I'm skeptical of that being the distinction between. I know that you've outlined, a whole variety of different communities. So I'm speaking too broadly to present it as like two tribes, but allow me to like reference it in kind of simplistic terms for a bit. So if you have people who like implicitly trust institutions and traditional authorities, I think that's a self-serving caricature for those who would present themselves as more skeptical of authorities, right? Because as I see it, most of the people that I know have a healthy skepticism for authorities. It's not that they they don't think that politicians are always telling the truth. They don't think that, every scientific study that comes out is providing the unvarnished like the truth, or every pharmaceutical company should be trusted with no critical evaluation. So I think that while there is like a variation in degrees of trust across communities, and I kind of would push back on the notion that there are a large community of people who are just have no skepticism of authorities and are willing to accept, whatever institutions say. That seems to me to just not represent a wide array of people. I might be being too optimistic about the world, but I think a lot of people are, to some extent cynical about traditional institutions, especially now.
Yeah. And like, as you read my papers, like I view it more as like the culture was like a multipolar thing. I do sense there's like, and I could be like totally wrong, I'm just sort of kind of guessing here, but like I do sense there's a fault line and perhaps like trust in, and this is why I highlighted that phrase, institutions we rely on for truth validation, like perhaps traditionally. And it almost seems like there's like a spectrum of trust, and maybe there's like a threshold that kind of like, if you're on this side of the threshold, then you're like in the heterodox sphere that gets like swayed by the the secular gurus, and if you're on the other side, then you're more sort of trusting of experts and consensus opinion and stuff like that. So that's sort of like my sense. I was curious, what do you think?
I think you're right. Like I contradicting myself, I do think that difference about the way that people approach institutions is like a significant dividing line between a whole bunch of different communities, and that there is the level of skepticism varies across them. So and it probably is one of the key distinguishing features. I guess the thing I want to emphasize in that is that it would be possible for people to accept mainstream authority positions without that kind of trust, though, right? Because you could still hold quite critical views, but regard it as like kind of like the best worst system, right? Like you have a whole bunch of criticisms about the way, very well about the way that academic publishing is skewed, for example, but you still think that, okay, with all that said, it is still true that we get pharmaceutical drugs that work, right? Or that we can build engineer planes and so on. So like there's I think that it's important to not divide it so that the heterodox sphere and the kind of conspiratorial sphere is the only one that is capable of having, a degree of skepticism towards authorities. That's the only hesitation I have, but I think you're completely right in the spectrum that you're drawing.
Yeah, and I like that distinction that you made, and I agree with it. It's like you can like not trust an institution, perhaps because they're biased, like legacy media or something like that, but they're still going to report the weather correctly or the sports stats. You can like you'll have confidence that in them in certain domains. So the other question I had, and I've got all my books, I did homework. The book Bullshit, Harry Frankfurt, the bullshit that you were talking about. And I think originally, I don't know that exact term, but I think it originally came from Harry Frankfurt's term bullshit. How people are more interested in persuading than the truth. And like we were talking on email about kind of critical thinking and the importance of critical thinking, and how a lot of people just give lip service to that, like Scientology or whatever. But critical thinking, and I want to kind of unpack like what does that actually mean. But it feels like that's an antidote in order not to get like persuaded by bullshit. And when people ask me to like, okay, like what's your critical thinking stack? I usually say 4 things, like no reasoning, like how to reason, like the meta language of reason, deductive, inductive, abductive, maybe have some logical fallacies, understand rationality, like, cognitive biases and stuff like that, have an epistemic methodology that's consistent, coherent, and then scientific literacy. And there's like a difference though, understanding like the propositional like set of those domains that are difficult to understand by itself, but also like a practice for like applying them. And like for like academic, like, and like the Stoas features a bunch of this, but like for the reasoning domain, like Walter Sinnott Armstrong, he's an academic in philosophy. He's awesome. Like, he recommends like he has a practice where you take articles from different biases from different news reports like Fox News or CNN, and then you just kind of like map it out in argument format. Less Wrong, the Center of Applied Rationality community, they have a lot of like stuff that you can apply there. Street epistemologists for like epistemic methodology. but there's like no like one mimetic tribe that has like practice for this, because you can talk about it, but if you don't like practice it, it's not going to be an embodied like skill. So I'm curious, like you personally, what is your like critical, like how do you understand critical thinking, and what is your like critical thinking talent stack that helps you kind of like not get swayed or spot these galaxy brains?
Yeah, so I guess I would probably sign off on a lot of the points that you emphasize, but I would also say that there are some things that are just like they're not very sexy, or not very appealing, because it's stuff like spending a long time to learn the basics about scientific research and methodology, right? Not going to the end point, but like actually doing foundational courses in research methodology or that kind of things. I'm not talking about just within academia. There's like I'm kind of constantly disappointed that there's these free access, there's Coursera courses, university level education, and a whole bunch of subjects that are free. You can access them, but people would rather spend 3 hours listening to, Joe Rogan talk to Robert Malone, rather than, take a course about virology from virologists. And I get why all of those incentives push in that direction, but I find it kind of disheartening. I think it's one of the things that I would emphasize is that if you want to get good at something, you have to spend the time to do it. There might be shortcuts, but like if you want to know about the research literature on ivermectin and you don't know how to assess clinical research literature, you can't just jump in and do that, because the bad analyses will look just the same as the good analyses. And if you instead, kind of what you mentioned, have built up a foundation whereby you know how to assess critically research literature, you know how meta-analyses work, and you've honed those skills on topics that are not culture war relevant, right? That you're not deeply invested in whichever mimetic tribe that you're a part of. I think that's important. And I would also say that related to that is an acknowledgement of limitations that you have. There seems to be a more prevalent tendency to pander towards people's desire to say that they can basically become experts in any topic by, listening to a podcast or having people explain something in over multiple hours. And you basically, I would strongly emphasize that, you can't replace 3 years of people like doing statistics analysis or something with a couple of hours listening to Eric Weinstein. You can't. And I think that acknowledging that truth, that basically we're all limited, we all have limitations to what we can know, and we're not experts in every subject. That has to be first and foremost about people who want to adopt a critical thinking stance. So I think identifying good sources is as equally as important as developing your own ability to, like assess a paper critically. Because, I think, for example, that for the vast majority of people who are talking about a medical topic, the best thing for them to do would be read a Cochrane review, not engage in, follow all the ins and outs on the debates on the internet, but just read a Cochrane review. But there's nothing particularly gratifying about that. Right? It's not like Cochrane reports are like hidden away secret knowledge, right? It's just something you can access, look at, and somebody else has done an analysis of the literature. They're not perfect. Like the Cochrane review for acupuncture, I think pretty much endorses it as useful without so I'm not saying that there's these kind of panacea approaches, but rather that building up those epistemic sources are important, recognizing your own limitations, and then doing what you said, Peter, which is like, looking critically at content you agree with, content you disagree with, and trying to break down the arguments and see. And I think it's always helpful to recognize what you want to be true and how that might be influencing what you're interpreting the rest of the, the actual evidence that exists there. So I tend to think, for all the bad press that they get, and all of the wrong turns that they've taken, the things that the skeptical community or the rationalist community, when it's at its best, identify are generally true. I just think that they need to be peppered with the like caveat that, awareness of your own limitations is really hugely important.
Yeah, I like that. And it's like the things that I mentioned, it's like it's good to for first principle thinking or whatever, but it's almost like additional skill set is needed in order to source out who to like outsource, kind of knowledge to, and how to. That's like an additional skill set. And it seems like there's this move, and maybe this is, I don't know, like a little bit of both sides, and so feel free to call me out on it. But in like the COVID culture, where it seems like a move I see is people on the like the COVIDiots side, it's just like knee-jerk reaction against experts. It's like, it's like wrong. And then people on the COVIDian side is like out like trust the science. So it's like kind of do my research versus trust the science. But either of those, and the more militant aspect, I'm not kind of like saying that this like the whole people who are either side of it are like this, but it's like I don't sense either one of those has a good like methodology to outsource knowledge to. And like feel free to push back on that, but I'm curious what you think.
No, I mean, I think it's like that's a pretty, the pandemic has revealed really clearly that there's a distinct lack of ability for people to assess the credibility of sources, and in some sense it's completely understandable, because why would everyday people know how to assess clinical literature about the effects of ivermectin? Why would people know about randomized controlled trials and the hierarchy of clinical evidence? Like, for most people, those are relatively esoteric topics that don't influence their life. But with the pandemic, everybody's kind of being forced into becoming experts in virology and epidemiology, right? And whether and I think for the guru people that we talk about, that pool is stronger. But like I say, I still find that the basic, like, take a very basic thing, which is that idea about a hierarchy of clinical evidence, right? That in vitro studies, you can find these amazing effects, usually because you can use like concentrations of chemicals that are so strong that if you actually put them in a person, it would kill them, right? But you can get these amazing effects, and then you'll often get small scale studies from people who are advocates of them finding positive effects, right? And that's a bit better. Like, now you're dealing with animals and humans in vivo studies, but once you start to then increase to get like higher quality, better controlled studies with larger samples, most of those effects don't pan out in the literature, right? In the just drug approval literature, a lot of drugs just don't get approved, or the effects are not found, right? And knowing that, you don't need to know, and you don't have to have had a position about ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine or whatever the next thing is that people will talk about. But people who know that criteria, when they came across the controversy surrounding ivermectin, it wasn't hard, right? It wasn't this very confusing thing. It was just, oh, there's low quality studies which seem to show some effects, so people should conduct like better controlled, stronger studies and see if there's an effect. That's what they did, and the result was negative, and it turned out there was a lot of fraud in the earlier studies. But to me, that doesn't reflect that there was some need for, a new approach. The basic standard unsexy approach of assessing the clinical validity of research literature applied. And I think that that's a specific case, but I think that applies more broadly, that, you know, in the Web 2.0 space, or whatever point we're on now, you have lots of people clamoring for your attention, and you have lots of, you know, kind of technical claims and unique appeals being made. And in some ways, it's a more complex world than it might have been, you know, 50 years ago. But in another way, what they're doing and the things that they're appealing to are very familiar to anybody who spends time, you know, reading histories about conspiracy theories or that kind of thing. So I feel like humans are not that, we're not that mystical. We're pretty, you know, simple social primates with social buttons that can be pushed, and dynamics that can be levered. So it's just, it's, I guess it's to say that I don't think we need really new like means to assess validity. We just have to apply the methods that we apply in our daily life, and in across a whole broad range of contexts, but to a new context, which is like an online space where you have much more access to people that are good at, you know, misrepresenting things or making appeals to emotion, and so on. So I'm not saying the social media environment isn't different. I just think that it's still pulling all of the psychological features that we had beforehand.
Right,
I don't
right.
know if that answered your question or waffled around it, but
Yeah, yeah. You know, I got so many other questions, but I'm going to ask one more, and then we'll put it to Q&A. And I like that project of trying to make these unsexy skill sexy in a way, like for in a different context too. It's like a project I don't think anyone's working on really. Um, and so you're sort of like a question for advice from you, like, because I think the cat's out of the bag in a way. A lot of people are learning how to think and you know, make sense outside of an academic context. And there's like various reasons for this. Like it just could be a strict cost benefit analysis. It's like too long or too expensive or
yeah.
whatever. Or they like the vibe of like what's happening outside of academia.
Hmm.
And then there's like whatever terms we want to use, like an epistemic commons or a wisdom commons is emerging. And from my sense, there's a lot of earnest people. Like there's the scene that the Stoa is in. It's like, it's not a podcast. It's like a communal podcast. So we have like kind of like sessions like this. We have like not unrecorded sessions where we just like, you know, debate and philosophize. And then like, you know, there's intellect, rebel wisdom. There's other spaces that are similar that have this communal aspect. And it's more about the community and not just sort of like, status games that like come on my podcast and, you know, itch my back, I scratch yours type of thing. So it's like a different energy and different vibe in this space. And I think a lot of us are trying to earnestly figure out how to do this right, you know, how to think right outside the context of academia. But honoring all the good shit that's happening and how to like interface with it. So I guess it's just an open question. Any kind of like advice or something that you would like to see that these emerging para-academic spaces could do or would do?
Yeah. So like the thing I would say, and I would strongly emphasize it, is like I'm involved with academia. I like academia, but I'm completely in favor of the kind of democratization of knowledge, and also I think there is lots of space online for, you know, interesting things that couldn't have occurred before to happen. Like the whole point with the courseware stuff that I was talking about is that's university level education and it's free. Anybody can access it, right? You don't have to pay for the qualification. You can just do it as an audit, I think they describe it. But I'm familiar with university courses. That's university courses, and it's open and freely available. And there's lots of access to good lectures, good discussions. And I don't think it's like, one thing I would say is that I don't think the goal for most places, especially online communities, should be to replicate what goes on in academia, because yes, there's loads of terrible things there that, you know, you don't want to replicate the scientific publishing industry or that kind of thing. But I also mean just the emphasis on what academia is about, right? Like it's perfectly fine, I think, to have communities that are about discussing ideas and interesting speakers and stuff, but don't regard themselves as, you know, doing it in an academic mode. And the I guess that the good side of academia that I find lacking in a lot of heterodox spheres, and it's quite ironic given the character of heterodox people, is that there's a tendency towards a lack of tolerance towards criticism. I'm not just saying this as a self-serving a justification of my existence. I mean it more that there's a view that people giving harsh critiques and pointing out that, that's something that somebody's arguing is like pseudo-profound bullshit, right? Like there's an inherent negative aspect to that. And it's kind of, I see represented as like being impolite or mean to people. But the thing that I really value about academia, and I think that it's feature that it's best at, is that you get brutal critiques, harsh critiques, and you learn that that's just part of what happens. And actually, people come to kind of, I'm not saying that all academics end up that they don't have a ego or they're not defensive of ideas. Like they're hugely defensive people with massive egos, right, about their ideas. But the ideal that basically people could tear each other apart in publication and then meet and be friendly, that really happens. I've seen it many times. And where I have not seen that is in a lot of heterodox places. People tend to take harsh criticisms as almost invalidating from interacting with the person again, or to take it really personally. And I know that criticism often feels very personal, and it can be, especially when it's about some ideas that you hold dear. So I think a greater openness to criticism, and to, in the same regards, like to a certain extent, policing what the quality of conversations are, right? Because it's easy if everything that everyone says is welcomed as, oh, interesting, and that's insightful, and but when you do that, you end up with QAnon, and you end up with pseudo intellectual spheres where a lot of kind of bullshit is being presented as if it's profundity. And I think heterodox spheres are often good at critiquing mainstream institutions, good at critiquing academics and politicians and so on, but bad at recognizing the very same features when they're found in heterodox thinkers, and the same problems in those communities. So I think that, like, an openness to criticism is a good thing. And in terms of specific, like, people, we recently covered Robert Wright. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he has a non-zero newsletter, and he's published a bunch of books, most recently Why Buddhism is True. And in many respects, he fits our model of a secular guru. He's like promoting a particular worldview, which he ties his politics into his view of psychology and his view of evolution. And it's this, big package. And he's got a following. He's got books. He regularly engages with, long form podcasting. But some feature which is different than most of the other people is that he's willing to engage with people critically. He has a tendency to issue caveats that are genuine, not strategic, right? Like saying, this is where I'm going out on a limb. This is where I'm on firm ground. And he's very open to the fact that there are legitimate criticisms of his position or alternative perspectives. And all of that is just to say that I don't want it to be framed that I think you can't be a public intellectual, have lots of ideas, that speculative ideas, or link things together, that's never legitimate. It's just that if you do that, you have to do it with the correct amount of, epistemic humility and the recognition of the how far your claims are extending. And I just see that so rarely, that it's kind of depressing. So that's not for general community members, but maybe it's for the people that become elevated within a community as the kind of, the thought leaders or that kind of thing.
Yeah. I think you're right about the criticism piece. This is why we're having a series at the Stoa too soon on how to be a critic. My friend Dufood Cosley is going to do that. But yeah, I wonder. It's like, yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's like another question I'm going to sneak in, but like, so in my sense, like, it's hard to understand the secular gurus like without understanding where they came from in a way, because a lot of them came from like their initial critique and their encounter with social justice warrior activists, woke people, and then sometimes they're just getting shouted on the street or hunted in their like Brett Weinstein or whatever. And I think like there's a point where they're just like any critique is just like kind of conflated into like like I'm being attacked, like fuck off, and then you're a good guy, bad guy.
Yeah.
And I think that phenomenon is not happening with everyone too, right? Like, but that phenomenon, I think it's something there to sense into and kind of unpack.
There's just to mention, Peter, on that it's not even noted by me. It was discussed by Brett Weinstein that a lot of the people that he recognizes as part of the intellectual dark world, the heterodox sphere, that they've gone through this trial by fire, right? The kind of public event where they stood up for truth, or as he sees it, stood up for truth against like the woke mob or whatever the case may be. And that this for me, it looks like a ritual initiation, right, where you're then experiencing that as like a dysphoric identity marker that other people are willing to endure, and then you can trust them. So costly signaling stuff goes into it as well. But even setting that aside, I think that the point you made about you have those inciting events which often push the people into prominence, and I think they're important as these kind of rites of passage that people go through in the heterodox sphere. But I also think this feeling of disenfranchisement and disillusionment with mainstream authorities, often that they fail to acknowledge properly the person's insight that they perceive they have, is really, really core and really common across all of the secular guru figures that we look at, almost all of them. It ties in with having a revolutionary theory, and a revolutionary theory is only such when it's not recognized as that, right? Because if it was revolutionary, it would be revolutionizing the field. So it has to exist apart from that. And I think that feeling that authorities and institutions have failed to appreciate what the insight that you've brought, it sounds mean, again, to like kind of emphasize that as an important feature of people, but it's so huge. Like if you want to look at the content of Jordan Peterson and Eric Weinstein and Brett and Robert Malone and so on, and you don't factor in their personal narratives of grievance with academic institutions, you really miss a huge part of what their worldview is about. And it's I think a little bit in heterodox sphere that can be seen as like ad hominem, or taking account of personality factors, when it should all be about ideas. But in my experience, if you want to understand the people and the approaches that they're offering, you have to look at both. You have to look at the contextual factors, you have to look at their personality and history and their ideas. And there's no reason that you have to completely separate all those things, because they're often informing each other quite a bit. So yeah.
There's so much to unpack, and perhaps we could got to jump on another call or something, but there's a lot here. But let's pivot to Q&A. We got a few. Evan McMullen, you got a few questions if you can.
Yeah, so I enjoyed the presentation. I guess my first question is, I'm kind of curious. So you mentioned the pandemic a couple times during your discussion with Peter, and I'm kind of curious. This might be a bit of a multi-part question, but was your Gurometer set of factors, which I understand is a sort of informal instrument, but was this created before, during, or after the pandemic? And for a little bit of context as far as why I ask this, you mentioned something along these lines when you were speaking, but the sort of, I don't know a better way to put this, but the sort of way that the almost entire structure of mainstream institutions during COVID, at least in the United States, and I think in most other places, international organizations as well, like the WHO, managed to really sort of consistently show their ass. I mean, they just were not behaving in an epistemically responsible manner. You mentioned some familiarity with the sort of less wrong style rationalists, and if you followed some of the blogs that those people put together, you would get extremely rigorous, well-researched articles that were, usually 3 or 4 months ahead of what the CDC or the WHO would be putting out there. Like the fact that COVID was in fact primarily airborne transmission. This was, denied by the legitimate authorities. And so I guess I'm wondering, because a lot of the factors that you put there may be in part the Cassandra Complex, the Grievance Mongering, the anti-establishment sentiment, all seem like maybe less inappropriate or less something to be super concerned about in light of that single example. But then also, if we sort of look at something in the neighborhood of Gell-Mann amnesia, where it's not something you're an expert at, you can look at the mainstream sources and realize all the mistakes they make, and then you go on and you flip the page and they're just accept what they're saying about everything else. I'm just kind of curious how that plays into this whole sort of 10-factor model here, because it seems like I'm having a hard time with that personally.
Yeah. So on the first point, about the like when we started the identifying those characteristics and the start of the pandemic, it would have been before, because we released the podcast in September 2020, and that came after a couple of months of discussion. So it would have been just before the pandemic that came out. So I don't think the features were related to that, although I suspect that the pandemic has heightened the expression of all of those things. But in regards to the point about rationalist communities or Slate Star Codex now, what is it, Astral 10, or the blogs, I would say that I probably, when it comes to the institutional authorities like the CDC and the WHO and that kind of public health institution, my approach and my view of them from the beginning of the pandemic is that to price in that you'll have miscommunication, that you'll have findings which are policies which are related to political view initiatives rather than scientific initiatives and so on, because that always happens, right? There's always trade-offs, and I have to admit I find it frustrating in this respect. And actually, Slate Star Codex had a very good article in this, where at the beginning of the pandemic, with the masks and the situation around masks, right, and what the advice should be on that, which is often presented as one of the huge failings that the mainstream institutions had. But when you look at the research literature about cloth masks in public settings, right, at the beginning of the pandemic, it wasn't good, right? It was a low quality literature, some positive studies, some negative, but overall not very good. And Slate Star Codex, I think, did a review of it at some point, and he came out at the end of that blog post of saying, okay, but even though the quality of the evidence isn't so good, the precautionary principle says, like, yeah, but we should wear masks. It's a low cost thing to do, and yeah, and so the advice should not be against it, even though the evidence is weak. Now, I completely agreed with that assessment of his, and I thought he did it well. But the part there that's important to me, and which seemed to get lost and still be lost in noise, is that like that literature wasn't particularly strong and was not like well developed. So you can imagine that there's public health officials weighing up costs and benefits and coming to different conclusions, right? Like in Japan, where mask wearing was common, everybody wore masks from the start of it, no question. In countries where it wasn't common, they were more hesitant and so on, and all those factor in. So I know I'm taking a long time to get to the point here, but I want to say that, like, I find that tolerance for evidence being mixed and that different institutions will come to different like conclusions. It's something that people should price in and not treat as like a surprising thing which happens and which reveals that institutions are not fit for purpose. It's just always going to happen with institutions in these kind of situations. And I guess related to that, I would push back a little that when I see people talk about the WHO, CDC, or all of these things, and I think the CDC is probably the one I'm least familiar with because I'm not, from the US, but they tend to focus on these points where, something they said something stupid, or somebody made a statement, or a mid-level person in the WHO hung up on somebody on a Skype call rather than mention that Taiwan was doing better than China, right? Like these kind of incidents definitely happen, and they definitely reflect something that people should know. Like the WHO, is a political organization. People within it are concerned about saying the wrong thing. But I think the basic advice that almost all of the public health bodies have offered since the beginning of the pandemic was keep away from groups. Like after a month or two, wear masks, right? And practice hygiene practices. Don't travel in large groups and so on. And like, I feel that basic advice, if you followed it, was pretty, would have got you most of the way there. And when it came to vaccines, their advice was once the vaccines go through the approval, take vaccines. And some of them, there's debates about the ages that it should be applied and so on. But when I tally up the score sheet of heterodox and non-heterodox, there's a surprising amount of heterodox people who have become openly anti-vax, right? Pseudoscience advocates for things. The rationalist community has not gone there, but I do think that like the rationalist community has a vulnerability in that it's open because they're so skeptical of like the existing institutions' ability to do their job. It means that like people see a Slate Star Codex blog where he's done a meta-analysis of 30 studies individually, like by himself, and then that's not feasible for most people to do. And the conclusion which he reaches, I've seen it then accepted across everywhere as he figured it out. And to me, that was just like a speculative meta-analysis. It was a decent meta-analysis, but it's just Scott's opinion. And I wish that like there was a wider application of skepticism, across the bar. I'm sorry I took so long, Evan, to say all that, but I think they're really it is good questions and it's difficult, but I still just I'm always wanting people in both spheres, the heterodox leaning or the institutional leaning, to apply their skepticism across evenly. I know it's not possible, but you can. It would be nice if we can get it like a little bit more evenly dispersed. So yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Like, I guess as a follow-up, so I'm kind of thinking about the historical context here because, like you said in your response there, it's sort of obviously the case that there will be political concerns injected into the statements of the sort of standard mainstream authorities. And I mean, I think that goes for everyone, right? Everybody is going to have some sort of political, consciously or unconsciously held motivation that's at least in part guiding their speech. And so I guess that the broader kind of context that I'm interested in your take on here is the sense of what even is the mainstream, because you talk about the skepticism of mainstream authorities. But for example, that COVID again gives us a pretty decent example here where, that we had pretty darn good scientific studies as of, like May of 2002, for example, saying COVID was almost certainly airborne in terms of its transmission. And then it took until May of sorry, I said 2002. I think I meant 2020 years, right? And then it took until May of 2021 for the WHO and CDC to, update their guidance to reflect this. So the question is the mainstream authority in this case the government agency, the CDC? Is it the International Health Organization, the WHO? Is it the researchers in virology and microbiology who were publishing the credible studies? Is it the people who were publishing the meta-analyses of such studies? And so, this sort of, I think, needs to be situated, at least in my opinion, in the broader context of the sort of breakdown of the mainstream in general. Like Peter has alluded to and talked a lot about in his written work, we exist in a sort of multipolar culture war scenario now, but I don't think culture war is even necessarily totalizing enough. Like it's crazy. You think about even the universities used to not be really different from the church, used to not really be different from the government, not so long ago in our cultural past. And so, now we've sort of moved into a situation of extreme multipolarity. And so advising somebody to, well, you should trust the credible mainstream authorities about X. And you tell, 10 different people that from 10 different cultural backgrounds, even within a single country like the United States. And you're probably going to get, well, 8 or 9 at least different, like inside of their head, who they think they should trust based on your statement. You should trust the mainstream authorities on X, or trust mainstream experts on X. They'll be finding different and conflicting authorities. So this, I guess, goes back to Peter's whole line of question about critical thinking. I guess, maybe my question here is, how would you suggest that we as individuals, embedded in this sort of context, should respond to this situation we find ourselves in, where even the act of determining which authorities we can, as Peter put it, outsource our sense making to, our critical thinking to, when we don't have time to do a Slate Star Codex style meta-analysis on every issue that might concern us, or that might be, something that we get asked about, or that we feel pressure to have an opinion about. It's just a really tricky situation, I think, for most people. And so I'm curious what your thoughts are, especially given the sort of breakdown of the cultural center and the notion of any sort of mainstream authority at all.
So I'm glad you're not suggesting a pandemic of 2002 preparedness, but on all of the other points. So, like you're right. You're completely right about that. When you talk about the mainstream or institutions, like there's tons of voices there, and there's a whole bunch of institutions, and sometimes they don't have the same advice, and sometimes individuals within the groups have different opinions, right? Very often the official guidance, when it's boiled down on a topic, it's a compromise between a whole bunch of people who have stronger beliefs leading one way or the other. And they're not that hard to find in the internet age, right? You can find people who make the recommendations for panels and say, well, my recommendation didn't really make it in to the final one, right? So in that situation, it is a good question about, well, who's the authority there? And when we're saying trust, if there's tons of different institutions and they're issuing different levels of advice, what do you follow? And I think the one thing I would say is that, although, like, I'm sure in medieval era there was a lot more centralization of authority and stuff, I don't think it's so new in that. I think the institutions within, like, at least Western democracies and non-totalitarian regimes have a long history of disagreeing with each other and not sharing information and debating what things mean, right? The CIA and the FBI and so on are rather infamous for this. But so I think you have to price that in, that, like, it isn't a matter of non-critically accepting anything that comes from an institutional body, right? Like some studies promoted by the CDC, it doesn't mean don't look critically at the study or statement. And it doesn't mean, for example, that you shouldn't look at what advice is being given from different health bodies from different countries. I think, we're in an era where we can do that, whereas in a past era, that wouldn't have been possible. So that that kind of information, I don't think you should avoid it. But I think that there has to be a or it's helpful, at least, not has to be, but it's helpful to realize that those disagreements, those debates, those uncertainties and errors that people will make and so on, they're not unusual and they're not a new thing. They're how it's always been when you have groups of people getting together and trying to find answers to things. And so you have to price that in as that's the default, and then try and with that as the default, that institutions are not always going to get things right, that people will make self-interested decisions and so on. Try and identify, okay, with that being the situation, what are the kind of recommendations or if it's in a scientific field, findings that I can regard as robust. And it really depends on what the topic is to what the correct approach is there. But I think a lot of what I see is that there's a kind of nihilism presented where who can trust the literature on given topic X, right? We know about the replication crisis. We know about pharmaceutical influences. We know that governments have their fingers on the scale. And what it often comes down to is an almost like postmodern approach to, so we all, we're all going to make our decisions about the authorities that we select to trust, and my decisions will differ from yours, but who's to say yours are better? And I don't agree with that relativism, because I think even though we have all these imperfections in systems, or even though we have all these biases, that it's still possible to identify better supported outcomes or to identify things which are resting on stronger evidence. And the rationalist community, when it's at its best, does that well. It tries to look and synthesize from a whole bunch of sources and identify, what is more strongly supported and what is recommendations. But I guess my pushback would be that finding consensus views or predominant consensus views in science is not as difficult, I find, as often portrayed. And to give an example where probably many in this audience might disagree with me, is that when it comes to the lab leak, for example, I know all about the letter to the Lancet and the various things that happened there, and I know about the Vox articles, right, representing the talking about the lab leak as a potential, racist conspiracy theory. But I also went back and looked at those articles, the academic articles and the reporting, and by and large, with a few exceptions, there was a very clear, kind of distinction made that it can't be ruled out the possibility that there's a lab leak, but there is a lot of people promoting these kind of conspiracies about bioweapons and stuff, which are extremely unlikely based on the current evidence. And there are politicians fanning the flame of xenophobia, based on presenting it as China creating the virus and releasing it on an unsuspecting West. And when I see the mainstream articles all published about this and look at the discussions and so on, you see in almost every one, there's a clear recognition that, okay, we find the evidence leaning strongly in this way or that way, but we cannot rule out entirely the possibility of an accidental leak or so on. You'll see the caveats, but then when I look at the kind of online discussion around it, it's presented as if no one was ever allowed to say that. If you said it at all, you would have been kicked off the internet and had your account removed. You would have been fired from your work as a racist xenophobe. And I think that's a misrepresentation. So when I look at the literature now, there's not that much has changed from, apart from more evidence has emerged, but the broad weight of the virology field leads towards a natural origin is on balance more likely. There's some people who weight the evidence different, but they're in a relative minority. And the comparison for me for the academic sphere discussing that and debating it and people having different weights and the way it's presented in the kind of online culture war sphere is just two completely different things. And the academic literature about it has not really, gone hyperbolically mad or completely changed its position. It's basically been saying the weight of evidence leans here, and it, tilts and moves slowly in one direction or the other. And then the culture war response is much more like ping pongs, as if, we found out, okay, now everything has changed and now the lab leak is the most likely scenario. And you see, Barry Weiss or Nate Silver or whatever talking about, just throwing out probabilities attached to things. And so I guess I know these are specific examples, but I'm using them to push back to say that there are times when the institutions or academic things seem to be taking a more sensible approach than the online debates around those fields. And I feel that when I talk to people who assess those, are familiar with assessing that kind of literature, or I talk to relevant there is a bias in the virologists I've spoke to about this, but my assessment of the, what they're thinking about the evidence, it's just not that surprising and in line with what I would have said from reading. And I'm not a virologist, right? So I'm very much relying on my ability to read like review papers and that kind of thing. So yeah, I guess I'm just saying that all of the things that you highlight are right about the difficulties in ascertaining like what's true or what we should trust. But I think that the kind of feelings of the mainstream institutions are sometimes oversold in the like online discourse. I guess that's my point. A very long-winded way to say it, but that's what I was trying to say.
Any quick follow-up, sure, Evan, before we...
No, I mean, this has been a fascinating conversation. It could go on forever, but I should be done.
Yeah, and then just that going back to that skill set of like an outsourcing methodology. I think just like a simple thing that could be just open source for just regular people to look into, that leads them to the same conclusion. Hopefully, if it's pointing to the truth.
I mean, I would say as well, Peter, that like me and Matt, just as an example, we're not the best example of that, but that's what we do on our podcast, right? Is like we try to look at people critically and then kind of, record it and demonstrate it. And you can agree or disagree with what we are doing, but the hope is to kind of illustrate, okay, so that's an example of, looking critically at content. And Matt is often referencing that it's similar to how he, would review a paper as an academic, right? Like, look at it critically and try to set aside your relative biases. It's not impossible to do that entirely, but so I my own endeavors, I think it is useful to do that, reflect that I think it is useful to do that, but I think there are other people doing it like much better as well. But so just to say, I think it is a valuable thing to do.
Cool. We're like way over time, so I want to respect your time, Chris. We do have a couple questions in the chat. Do you have time for one more, or should we close out?
I can. You can. I'm fine. Maybe I can. It's my own fault with my like long-winded answers. So, I'm fine to go for another 15 minutes till the hour.
Cool. We'll sneak in one more question. Kevin, you had a question.
Oh man, let's see. How's it going? Chris, I was looking you up. I've listened to your podcast a few times, and I looked into your old research, and it was really, really fascinating stuff. Like, I'd love to ask you about like all these rituals you attended and stuff. And I could ask 1,000 questions, so let me try and make it concrete. It seems like you've these experiences are such like visceral, like with lots of meaning, and then you kind of like the work of like the cognitive religion kind of goes in and like tries to keep amount of distance from it. And I think there's a benefit to that, but I'm wondering, like, also people like make a lot of decisions based on their emotions, right? And we sort of mentioned earlier, like the SJW canceling of these gurus and whatnot. And I'm feeling like with COVID, and like you had a paper in 2017 about like the election of Trump and how that was kind of like this weird ritual thing. I'm wondering like how like this visceral experience that people are having, like a lot of it is based on fear, like they're either afraid of people dying or like their freedom is being trampled on. And I feel like a lot of the sort of gurus are tapping into that energy. Sorry, I haven't really wrapped up a question. My brain's been turning into mush slowly.
That's my
I'm just really,
responsibility, probably.
yeah, I'm really curious how you sort of went from that research realm into this, and like what takeaways you're making, and
so yeah, I think I can highlight a couple of things that are relevant to that. And I will say, Kevin, that there's on the point that you made about, and we discussed that a bit earlier about the the public denunciation, or the kind of dysphoric event that people went through, many of the guru people went through. One thing that I found when looking at those events is that I assumed, as I think everyone or most people did, that a lot of those people, like they were created by the event, right? Their public profile was created because of the attention from that event, and then they go on to do other things. But I will say that at least in some fairly high-profile cases like Brett Weinstein and Jordan Peterson, it subsequently emerged that those people have, long before they have that event, had the kind of history of like regarding themselves, like Jordan Peterson talked about to colleagues about wanting to start a religion, and was kind of chastised for the content of his course being hugely speculative, mixed with mainstream stuff, and the two not being separated well enough. So I guess I'm just adding a note of caution that I think from the stories that I've looked into there, like with Brett at Evergreen, his background was that he regarded himself as having discovered this revolutionary finding that undermines all of the safety of pharmaceutical in the US, and there were various other events that I won't go into, but just to say that I wasn't attracted to the notion that the people being created by those events, but I think in large respect, it might be more that those events are actually acting as a catalyst for specific types of personalities and people who already see themselves as having, a kind of something to offer the world. So it's not the main point that you raised, but I just wanted to mention it. And in terms of my research and the links to what I'm doing on the podcast and that kind of thing, the cognitive science of religion was interesting to me because I find religion as a social phenomenon extremely fascinating and kind of influential. Not even related to my background in Belfast and Catholics and Protestants, but more the looking at the effects that religion or religious devotion, religious beliefs can have on communities and can have on individuals, regardless of any of the metaphysic components of it. So cognitive science of religion really appealed to me from that respect, and it was looking at the psychological mechanisms and treating it as an evolutionary approach. And my interest in secular gurus and that kind of thing grew from a broader interest in skepticism and atheism, and the kind of not really online rationalism, but those those communities. So I think my character has always been one which is focused on trying to apply critical tools like that and to look at social phenomenon behind the kind of values and emotional attachment that people might put to them, and focus more on the psychological and the group dynamics. And that applies just as much to rituals and religious communities as it does to gurus and conspiracy theories. Like they're all just different arrangements of social phenomenon. So I think there's a link there, and I do see a lot of links in the dynamics that I've studied with rituals and religious beliefs, because in my understanding of that is that most of those mechanisms apply across a whole variety of fields, right? Rituals tend to be viewed by people as like masses and ceremonies and those kind of things, but in actual fact, our whole lives are full of daily rituals, and we can't really function in like cultures without affluency with the rituals of a given society. So I have found that aspect interesting, and it probably relates to why I find the communities that develop around guru figures and the heterodox sphere and so on interesting in the same respect. I think it's the same kind of like motivations. I suspect that again was meandering, but hopefully got to some of the points that you were curious about.
One really quick follow-up. Does getting a PhD count as a dysphoric ritual?
Yes. It definitely does, especially in my case. I can say so. So yeah. It's a type of dysphoric ritual, just in a very extended, elongated one.
Thanks, Kevin. So we'll close here. Chris, any parting words you'd like to leave us here today at the Stoa, or anyone watching?
No, I don't have any important wisdom to share. I will say that if you happen to appreciate the kind of thing that we do on Decoding the Gurus, there's 2 podcasts that I think are really good that do similar sorts of things. But one is Knowledge Fight, which does 2 or 3 episodes a week on Alex Jones content, and that might sound like suffering, but it's if you wanted to understand about conspiracy communities and the narratives that they're using, it's really good, and it's also shows how much overlap there is with like sort of the mainstream heterodox sphere, which is quite concerning. And then the other one is the Conspiratoriality Podcast, which looks at the kind of overlap between like health and wellness and alternative medicine, yoga world, and the kind of rise of conspiracy theorizing and kind of right-wing populist movement within those communities. So we have no affiliation or anything like that. Just I like those as sources that do something similar to what we do, but maybe better. So I'd recommend them if people have interest. Oh, and This Week in Virology, if you want like a mainstream approach to information about viruses and the pandemic.
I think you're the first person who plugged someone else's podcast when he came on, so that's a Stoa first. I'll make some closing announcements in a moment. But Chris, thank you so much for coming to the Stoa today. That was an awesome session. I'll plug an event coming up tomorrow. I'm actually kind of afraid because all the Stoa titles will have woo sounding, tomorrow, the non-naive trust dance with Malcolm Ocean. He's going to bring his technique here on how to build trust with people you vibe with. So you can check that out. That's 6 p.m. Eastern time. And more events can be found at thestoa.ca. So that being said, Chris, everyone, thank you so much for coming to the Stoa today.
Thanks, everyone.